Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage welcoming you to the liberated zone of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist and internationalist world affairs program with a jazzy music mix. Our agenda for this Saturday, July 15th, 2023, we commence with Sister Jill Scott singing the new national anthem, which she wrote 32 years ago at the age of 19, followed by our Sister Luyanda Kaboko and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Professor Camilla Hawthorne, Associate Professor of Sociology and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz, and author of the book Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean. And later this hour, Dr. Horne interviews Professor Kaysha Corinealdi, Assistant Professor of World History at Emerson College in Massachusetts, and author of the book Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean World Making in the 20th Century. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Dizzy Gillespie, Alfredo Rodriguez, Ray Oviedo, Jeremy Pelt, Jeff Hamilton, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, get ready to listen to some Jill Scott, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
19 years old. Ready? I'm 51 now, by the way. Oh, say, can you see by the blood in the streets that this place doesn't smile on you, colored child, whose blood built this land with sweat and their hands. But you'll die in this place, and your memory erased. Oh, say, does this truth hold any weight? This is not the land of the free, but the home of the slave.
Buenos dias. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboko with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, with critical dates and events in humanity's struggle against the greedy profiteers of the imperialist nations. July 18, 1964. The Whites Rebellion breaks out over the issue of police brutality against African men, but was the tip of the iceberg of African people's frustration with the racist structure of the U.S. government. The Watts Rebellion and the subsequent rebellions and the Black Power movement throughout the United States ushered in an era of appeasement, with Africans in the United States being given access to European universities, jobs, military, non-profit funding, housing, and much more, all in an effort by the ruling class to co-opt the potential revolutionary growing consciousness of the masses. They also wanted to demonstrate to the world, and especially the newly emerging African and Caribbean countries, that the U.S. was removing the old shackles of segregation and ushering a new era of integration. The U.S. was competing with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics for ideological hegemony throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. July 18, 1936. The start of the Spanish Civil War, which by many was considered the most important social revolution in Europe of the 20th century. Workers organized self-managed factories, and peasants organized voluntary collectivization of villages and farms. This was the first European war against fascism, which would come to characterize Germany and Italy and lead to World War II. Many anti-fascists of all nationalities, in the spirit of internationalism, joined the ranks of anti-fascists in the Civil War against General Francisco Franco, who overthrew the democratically elected Republican government. The fascists included the landed elites, the urban bourgeois, the Roman Catholic Church, and other conservatives who fully supported the rise of fascist state of Spain. July 19, 1928. Nwanyeruwu, led by Aba rebellions of 1928 in Nigeria. Nwanyeruwu, together with a cadre of women, forced the British colonialists to abolish a tax they had wanted to impose on women for being women. Their actions sparked continued anti-British agitation. July 19, 1979. The Sandinistas, a mass-based Latin American movement to liberate Nicaragua from the fascist Somoza dictatorship, which the United States, the CIA, and multinational corporations had propped up for more than 30 years, ascends to power, providing social programs and economic reforms that uplifts the quality of life for the workers, peasants, and indigenous people of Nicaragua. July 20th, 1925. Frantz Fanon, an African born in Martinique in the Caribbean, was born. He was educated at the Sorbonne of France in psychology and became a leading Pan-African militant in the National Liberation Front of Algeria, which led to the Algerian Revolution against French colonialism. He authored numerous books on the psychology of oppressed versus the oppressor, including The Wretched of the Earth, a mandatory reading for the Black Panther Party, SNCC, and numerous revolutionary movements throughout the world. July 21st, 1967. Albert Lutuli, author of Let My People Go, the autobiography of a leading African National Congress traditional chief who leads the struggle for freedom from the racist South African regime. July 21st, 1982. The settler colonial Zionist state of Israel invades Lebanon in a feeble attempt to destroy the PLO and the Lebanese resistance movement. Tonight, we interview one of the foremost experts on Zionism and the relationship to Lebanon and the United States. July 22nd, 17th century. Awashanks, a Native American woman warrior who fought the English to a standstill, based upon a Native American confederation to repeal all whites from the native lands. July 22nd, 1796. 600 freed Maroons immigrate to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, from Jamaica in an effort to establish a free society. July 23rd, 1952, Egypt breaks from the British neo-colonial regime of King Farouk, and state power is seized by the secret society of dissidents known as the Free Officers Committee, headed by Gamal Abdel Nasser. This signifies the return of Egypt, or Kemet, to its independent status as a free African state devoid of European control. July 23rd, 1892. His Majesty Haile Selassie Jah was born. Haile Selassie, the last emperor of ancient Ethiopia, was the leader of African resistance to colonialism, hence has become the god of living truth for the Rastafarian movement and a central reoccurring theme in reggae music and among all Pan-Africanists. Ethiopia, the birthplace of all humanity, the first Christian state, the only country in Africa not to be successfully colonized during the European terrorist assault upon Africa, is the most mentioned country in the Bible, whether said to be Kush, Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. July 24th, 1914. Marcus Mosiah Garvey begins organizing the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an African Community League in Jamaica, to become the largest black organization worldwide up to and including today. Its slogan, Africa for the Africans, becomes the war cry for over 53 African nations fighting colonialization. This has been Freedom Now's weekly historical component here at KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, Southern California, always streaming live worldwide on the web at kpfk.org. So please join us wherever you are, in the words of those on the motherland and in the diaspora, as we chant Amandla, which means power, and the response is Awetu, which means is ours. The power is ours. Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
From KPFK Pacifica in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Camilla Hawthorne, Associate Professor of Sociology and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and author of the book Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Pacifica, Professor Hawthorne.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book? How did you get involved in studying Italy? And what is the Black Mediterranean anyway?
So this book really arose from my own personal experiences. My mom is a white Italian who grew up in a small town in northern Italy. My father's a Black American, born in Virginia, grew up in Oakland, was drafted during the Cold War, right at that moment when they stopped sending young men to Vietnam but hadn't ended the draft. So they met in Italy in the 70s, fell in love, and moved back to California, where I was born. But because of Italy's citizenship laws, I was born with Italian citizenship through my mother, grew up speaking English and Italian and spending big chunks of my life in Italy with my mom's family. And so over the years, Italy became a major country of immigration in the 80s and 90s. I was born in 87. And so over the years, going back and forth to Italy, I would start to see more and more people who looked like me and my family. And I was really curious to understand their stories, their experiences, their political mobilizations, in part because as I went on to, university, doing Africana studies and Black studies work, so much of the literature that I was reading was really thinking about Blackness through the lens of the United States and North America, but I just wasn't really reading that much about this corner of the Black diaspora that is in Italy. So for me, the Black Mediterranean is a way of thinking about the histories of racialization, of racial capitalism and political mobilizations across the Black diaspora of the Mediterranean region. So really inspired by Paul Gilroy's work of thinking about the Black Atlantic as a kind of cultural cauldron that produces certain politics and practices of Blackness. With the Black Mediterranean, my fellow scholars and I really try to say, what happens if we also think of the Mediterranean as this site through which Blackness is lived and contested, with deep histories in terms of the origins of racial capitalism, in terms of Italy's colonial ventures on the African continent, legacies of fascism, and then contemporary cross-Mediterranean migrations today.
Speaking of legacies of colonialism, we know that Italy has had a fraught relationship with its neighbor to the south, speaking of Africa, seeking to colonize Libya in the early 20th century. Reportedly, the first aerial bombing takes place at the hands of Italians in Libya, North Africa, invading Ethiopia in the 1890s and the 1930s, involving the deployment of poison gas. To what extent is Italian colonialism in Africa acknowledged, even by the left in Italy today?
It is to this day still not talked about enough as a major and central part of Italian history. In the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of important breakthroughs by work from historians and cultural studies scholars who have really critically reinvestigated Italian colonial history in ways that are challenging a lot of the whitewashed narratives, right? The idea that Italy was a weak and ineffectual colonial power, or that Italy was a benevolent colonial power, or that racism was not part of Italian colonialism. All of these things are patently false. And so we have a few generations now of scholars who've actively been trying to really set the record straight. But the challenge now is that that work still needs to really extend beyond the university and enter kind of broader public consciousness. There's also a new generation of Black Italian writers who are writing fiction and memoir that really places Italian colonialism at the center of how we think about the current politics of Blackness and racism today. And as you say, Italian colonialism was deeply racial. And in fact, we can really only understand contemporary xenophobia, anti-Blackness, restrictions on citizenship by thinking about the racial restrictions that were enacted in the colonies. The Italian military committed war crimes, used poisonous gases, right, to suppress anti-colonial uprisings. So this story is really important. And also, it's not only a fascist history. A lot of times Italian colonialism is sort of seen as just tied to fascism, but Italy actually began acquiring colonial possessions as the process of national unification was unfolding. So you literally can't tell the history of the Italian nation state coming together at the end of the 19th century without also talking about Italy's process of colonial expansion.
So today, ruling in Rome is a neo-fascist Prime Minister Meloni. Do you see any parallels between her rise and the rise of neo-fascism in today's Italy and that of a similar phenomenon right here in North America?
Yes, absolutely. And, that's not at all a coincidence, right? If there's anything that we've seen over the last few years, it's that these far-right white nationalist movements are very much engaging in political strategy and networking and learning from each other, right? So during the Trump administration, Italy had Salvini, right? And at this moment, we're seeing, the rise of Meloni alongside the rise of a kind of white Christian ethno-nationalism in the United States using very, very similar topics, right? Explicit anti-Blackness, concerns about birth rates and ethnic replacement, attempts to strip away the rights of LGBT and gender non-conforming people. So it's not a coincidence that these parallels exist, because they are part of a kind of global fascist white nationalist strategy.
Now, there's a phrase in northern Italy that suggests that Africa starts south of Rome. And certainly, if you look at the history of Sicily, the island off the southern tip of Italy, you see an intertwining of Sicilian history with African history, which in turn is manipulated against them. Which brings me to my question: is there a regional twist to anti-Blackness in Italy? That is to say, is it more intense in the north, less intense in the south, or is it about the same from north to south?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And I think that there are regional differences in the way that this kind of anti-Blackness plays out across Italy, in much the same way that there are national differences, say, in the way that anti-Blackness plays out between, say, the United States and Italy. At the same time, though, right, racism really exists across the whole of the peninsula. I learned this firsthand doing interviews with Black activists in northern Italy, in places near Naples. And I think one thing that's really interesting to note is that the Lega Party, right, the right-wing Lega Party, started as the Lega Nord, or the Northern League, which was a kind of northern separatist, distinctly anti-Southern party. And relatively recently, the Lega dropped the Nord from its name in an attempt to also garner votes in southern Italy. And in fact, right, we've seen that the number of votes that this party is getting in the South are increasing. And I think it has to do with sort of a particular attempt to rebound the boundaries of Italianness in a way that includes the North and the South. And then the new supposedly external enemy is now seen as immigrants and people of color, who are positioned now as a threat to both Northern and Southern Italians.
Now, what about the relationships between Italian Americans on the one hand and Black Americans on the other? For example, many sports fans are familiar with the exploits of the late, great Pittsburgh Steeler footballer Franco Harris, who was of Italian and African descent, or the baseball catcher formerly with the Dodgers, speaking of Roy Campanella, a similar racial and ethnic ancestry. At the same time, we know that in a place like New York City, Little Italy, or even Staten Island has Italian-American precincts that are dripping with anti-Blackness. How do you assess this kind of contradictory pattern?
This is also another important question that talks to the complexities of racialization, and one that I should say my colleague John Gennady has written about extensively in a beautiful book called Flavor and Soul, that's about the connections and clashes between Italian Americans and African Americans. And this is a story, this is very much related to my own story, right? I have an Italian mother and African American father, and in fact, there are, a couple generations of people like me who, had an African American father that was in the military, an Italian mother. In fact, this was the subject of a lot of Italian films and concerns from the state about African Americans in Italy who came either during the Cold War or during the liberation of Italy in World War II. But we see throughout U.S. history all sorts of examples, of these moments of, what John Gennady calls kind of collusion and also conflict between Black and Italian communities. I mean, if anyone, pays any attention to pop culture, right, Giancarlo Esposito is, perhaps one of the most famous, people who represents this meeting of two cultures. But it wasn't, the dividing line wasn't always so clear, because after the unification of Italy, right, Italy was one of the largest sources of immigrants to the rest of the world. The Italian diaspora is one of the largest voluntary diasporas in world history. Millions of Italians left the country, and many of them came to the United States. And when they arrived to the United States, they were not regarded as fully white. And in fact, the same racial theorization from within Italy that insisted that there was a racial biological difference between northern Italians, who were seen as more white, and southern Italians, who were seen as closer to African, influenced the way that Italians were received in the United States. And in fact, even was cited, that same research from Italy was cited in anti-immigrant restrictions in the US that were attempting to limit the immigration of Southern Europeans and especially Italians into the US. So when Italians began arriving to the US, oftentimes they were considered racially or ethnically closer to Black than to white. And I think part of where we see these deep tensions and a lot of anti-Blackness and conservatism in the Italian-American communities today has to do with, right, this terrible bargain of inclusion into whiteness. So the process by which Italians were made white involved a buying into the sort of logics of white supremacy. But, that being said, there's still these deep histories that I think are important to hold on to. And I say this as someone who is also an Italian American, right? For every, Italian who is fighting back against the removal of Columbus statues, or is fighting to, hold on to Columbus Day, again, which was part of the sort of assimilation of Italians into American whiteness, there are radical leftist Italian Americans who are saying, we have Sacco and Vanzetti, we have other radical Italian figures who don't stand for this kind of hyper-capitalist, white supremacist politics of inclusion. And I'm reminded of something that Cedric Robinson wrote from his notes that are at the beginning of the book, Futures of Black Radicalism. And he notes that the struggles of African Americans and the Irish have to be understood as intertwined because of their shared histories of racializations. And he says, therefore, we can understand the Irish as comrades in struggle. And I think that it's really important to sort of understand Italians and African Americans also as potential comrades in struggle because of these connected histories.
Just a footnote to the previous question. I recall that in a pivotal election, I believe it was 1947, the United States was seeking to help to destabilize the Italian Communist Party, which had accumulated enormous prestige because of its anti-fascist role during World War II. And it enlisted Italian Americans to reach out to their relatives across the Atlantic on an anti-communist basis. And I'm wondering, since that time, are you familiar with any efforts by Italian Americans to intervene in Italian politics, either from the left or from the right?
Yes, I think in both directions, because if you have Italian citizenship and you're registered as an Italian living abroad, you actually constitute a constituency of the Italian citizenry that is represented in certain national elections. So there is a kind of diaspora constituency, and I've definitely seen attempts to really kind of mobilize these communities in diaspora, really from both sides.
Now, what about Italy's neighbors? How do you assess anti-Blackness to the east in the Balkans, or to the north in Switzerland, or in France for that matter? Is it more intense, less intense? Does it have impact on Italy itself?
Yeah. So again, this is where my background is as a geographer, right? So I'm always thinking about kind of regional and geographic specificity. And so thinking in terms of, the particular histories of regions and how those shape the politics and histories of racialization is really key. There's a lot that Italy shares with France, even though the particular histories of colonialism and migration in both of those countries are distinct. What they do share is a kind of liberal politics of anti-racism or color blindness in the post-World War II period, right? So an idea that, we're not going to talk about race. Race doesn't exist, so we won't talk about it, and somehow that will make racism disappear, right? An idea that we should sort of focus on everyone simply being an equal citizen. Of course, we've seen both in the case of Italy and in France, how that kind of denial of the existence of racism or race as a social reality and axis of power has played out. And I think we see the rise, the resurgence of the far right in both of these countries really happening because of the limitations of that strategy, that just don't say race strategy for addressing racism. It ends up leaving this massive political vacuum that can then be filled killed by these right-wing parties because there weren't concerted efforts to really get to the roots of structural racism sooner. Eastern Europe is a slightly different case, and part of that has to do with the fact that Eastern Europe's own inclusion within the family of European whiteness has often been in question at different moments. And in fact, that's something you could say that Eastern Europe shares with Italy, right? Both the East and the South of Europe have been part of, for hundreds of years, this kind of at the forefront or at the borders of Europe, and therefore sites of contestation over whether or not these sites count as fully white or fully European. And so I think that the politics of exclusion and anti-Blackness play out in particular ways in these places where, again, the enactment of particularly strict xenophobic border restrictions and a kind of virulent anti-Blackness becomes a way of asserting their place within the family of European nations. So it's almost a way of making a claim to Europeanness through anti-Blackness and xenophobia.
Finally, Professor Hawthorne of UC Santa Cruz, author of the book Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean, would you encourage young Black women who would like to walk in your footsteps in the 21st century to come study with you in the sociology department in Santa Cruz?
I always welcome young Black scholars, especially Black women, who want to really be involved in the project of provincializing the United States and thinking about the Black diaspora on a global scale. So if anyone is interested in learning more about what it would mean to do that kind of work here with me at UC Santa Cruz, I encourage you to reach out. And I will also say that we are in the midst of an ongoing struggle for fair wages for graduate students. So it's important for me to kind of state the political stakes of this work and sort of this kind of appeal, which is that grad students in the UC system are horrifically underpaid, and Santa Cruz is one of the most expensive cities to live in the United States. So it's important to know that when you're applying to work in the UC system, and if you decide that you're willing to be part of that struggle, right, then I would say come to Santa Cruz, let's study together, and let's also fight for living wages for all graduate students in the UC system.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Hawthorne, Associate Professor of Sociology and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at University of California, Santa Cruz, author of the book Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles, Pacifica.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
From KPFK Pacifica in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Professor Kaysha Corinealdi, Assistant Professor of World History at Emerson College in Massachusetts, and author of the book Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean World Making in the 20th Century. Welcome to Freedom Now Pacifica, Professor Corinealdi.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you write this book?
I wrote this book as a way to connect histories that are both familial histories, but also histories of the United States and of Latin America that I did not really have an opportunity to learn about or engage with as a student. So I myself was born in Colón, Panama, and have about 4 generations of family born in Panama. And one of the things that really always stood out for me was this deep respect and admiration that many would have for the community networks that they were raised by, meaning the sort of largely Afrocentric Black city spaces, schooling, etc., and how that contrasted almost fully with what was presented nationally as the image of the nation, right? Where often there was depictions of white or mestizo Panamanians on one hand. So that desire to understand that the experience at this juncture was one facet. And then the other for me was, as a young migrant in the United States, really reflecting on the fact that most people, when they heard Panama, maybe they thought Panama Canal, but that for most, there was not really an in-depth understanding of the rich history of not just the isthmus, but also the relationship between Panama and the United States, the dynamic presence of people from throughout the Caribbean in Panama, before the canal, but certainly during and after, in addition to sort of there being this long African diaspora history that tied Panama to the transatlantic slave trade, et cetera. So all these histories that I myself did not encounter, paired with my own family's recollections on what their lived experience and what they were in turn not also taught of or displayed in terms of popular depictions of national life were some of the factors that led me to writing the book.
Now, we know that there have been Africans in Panama as early as the late 16th century, but you focus on early 20th century migration from places like Barbados, Jamaica, etc., in order to build the canal. Mm-hmm. And you suggest that the elites in Panama sought to manipulate tension between the Black Spanish-speaking population and the Black English-speaking population. How so?
That's right. So to your point, there was an African presence, and then descendants of Africans in Panama from the 16th century. And in fact, much of the architecture surrounding some of the churches spanning from Panama all the way to Peru very much have connected to the slave trade that formed part of the isthmus all the way to South America, in addition to the permanence and creation of cultures of resistance, like the Congo culture in places like Colón, that really derived a lot of their experiences on Maroonage and what it meant to have actually created these communities of resistance alongside Spanish colonial expansion, and also some of the competition between those imperial Spanish and English powers. So that's really taking you to the 16th century. By the time you get to the 19th century, you also have, at this time, Panama is part of Colombia, and so the tensions there are around a conservative government and a liberal government that is vying to see who's going to actually have citizenship rights or not. And that's where you already begin to see some of the anti-Blackness discourse that precedes the migration that I talk about in the book, but that is very important to recognize, because you start to understand that maintaining this image of Panama as a nation that isn't part of an African diaspora, but instead I sort of talk about it as an Iberian, almost mestizo nation, are the conflicting narratives. So once you have migration, especially by the mid-19th century and onwards, of people coming from throughout the English and French-speaking Caribbean for industries like the railroad, the banana industry in Bocas del Toro, the canal, first by the French, then by the US, we have many of those doing this employment actually seeking out these particular islands in the Caribbean. And that has a lot to do with British imperialism, the end of slavery there, and this idea of how do you actually make ends meet. So many are trying to come to terms with this post-abolition experience. They make their way to Panama, and now there is this desire of, let's have this canal built, but let's now have these people return, right? Once the completion of this canal has happened. That rhetoric really is one that is false, given that already by the mid-19th century, you had churches, schools, a number of enterprises that were created by these migrants. And in fact, you had many coinciding with Blacks in Panama who had been there, from 18th century onwards, who were Spanish speaking. And this leads to an effort at creating an otherizing and creating a narrative of the better Blacks, right, who are often described as coloniales, right, forming part of this colonial period, and those that are from the Caribbean described as Afrantillanos. And this discourse is really one that's erected and created by an elite and government officials that are trying to essentially pit Black people against one another, in the sense by saying these are foreigners who are trying to take from you and who've never really been part of this country, notwithstanding how many generations they might be in the country, and you are the ones that we actually want by our side. But what's revealed is that there really is not an interest, an investment in having the leadership and presence of Black Panamanians by this elite. But it's really convenient to try to present Afro-Caribbean Panamanians as the problem rather than attack the white elite establishment that is in control of government, in control of commerce, with very close relationship with the United States, and still nonetheless presenting these groups as the enemy. So part of the book is wanting to map that out and de-essentialize what, especially in the 20th century, became this push at talking about, well, there are different types of Black people who have not liked each other, and instead suggest there's always been diversity within Black communities, but this specific push at pointing to this narrative of Spanish speaking versus English speaking is intended to divide and not to really highlight that diversity of culture and linguistic experience.
Now, what about the impact of Marcus Garvey's movement in Panama? Was it significant?
It was. Outside of the United States and Cuba, the largest numbers of UNIA offices and sort of centers were in Panama. You would have advertisements for things happening in UNIA related churches, schools, halls that were created into the 40s and 50s. So I had the opportunity to look through newspapers like the Panama Tribune that focused on Panama, but really the broader Black diaspora. And they were very fascinated by Marcus Garvey, who visited Panama a number of times, who also his father had connections to Panama. And there was also a lot of people very much invested in this idea of Black liberation, Black freedom, that not all necessarily in line with the idea of a return to Africa, but very much invested in calling out and unearthing the racism that was affecting people in the Western Hemisphere, in places from Panama to France, where there was this focus on describing it. And one of the things that stood out for me in doing some of the research on the UNIA is the degree to which schools and other enterprises became a focal point of these communities. You had so many independent schools pop up in places like Colón. You also had campaigns and organizations that were held in these halls, where you similarly had leadership by men and women, and that was like a really fascinating component of it as well. So that in itself could have been a whole other book that could have been written just on the UNIA presence in Panama, because Garveyism, even though sometimes that the man himself was critiqued by some of the leaders in Panama as they were developing what they wanted for those in Panama, there was still a great admiration for the movement writ large and what it meant to have a conscious way to push back against white supremacy and xenophobia.
Now, what about President Arias? 3 times the president of Panama, first time in the 1940s, close to fascist. Mm-hmm. Did his pro-fascist ideology have any connection to anti-Blackness?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that becomes fascinating to see is that he was on par with those that of the elite, but also in his case, those educated in places like Harvard and the United States that wanted to think about eugenics as a way to better Panamanian society. And in this case, this idea of, well, who are the groups that we want to not see having children, migrating, etc., to Panama? And he explicitly points to Black migrants as the problem and their children as a perpetuation of that problem. And so within his own roles as part of the head of the Department of Health, later on when he becomes president, there was always this focus on the problem that we have are these specific kind of Black people, which again, it's very convenient to sort of say it's one kind of Black people, when in the end, it becomes very difficult to say, well, this is actually that group that we're attacking versus the other. When you're in the streets, when you're congregating, et cetera, people are not able to differentiate in that way. But there was this focus of creating this fake vocabulary and fake understanding of enemies of the nation that Arias very much shared what we saw Trujillo doing in Haiti, with certainly what we saw Mussolini and Hitler doing in looking at foreign enemies from within, notwithstanding people being born and having several generations therein. So there's very much a connection between anti-Blackness, fascism, and xenophobia that Arias encapsulates in a really horrifying way by the 40s and beyond, but that precedes him, right? So in the book, I talk about these incidents like Panama for the Panamanians that are people that were already bringing forth these nativist practices that had a lot of anti-Black discourse associated with them. He encapsulates it because he's elected president, right? And has the power to convince many of those in the legislature, and many follow along gladly, right? So it's not just him manipulating people, follow along in this discourse of it is okay to denationalize and take away the rights of people in our country based on their race and linguistic practices. So Arias is definitely someone that, for those examining the links between anti-Blackness and fascism in the Americas, there's a lot to be gleaned there in terms of how it's nourished, how it's discussed, and even the ways that the populace is invited to partake in that narrative as this is about them and not you. You're one of the good ones. That too is something that I found really unnerving in doing the research, but also very necessary to discover and read through.
Now, what about the canal and the canal zone? That area traditionally, at least for a good deal of the 20th century, was dominated by Washington, dominated by U.S. imperialism. In fact, the late Senator John McCain was actually born in the Canal Zone, although interestingly enough, when he ran for president, questions were not raised about his citizenship, even though he was not born on the U.S. mainland. But in any case, we understand that Washington imposed a wicked kind of apartheid on the Canal Zone. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. So the Canal Zone for white U.S. citizens was a socialist paradise, right? You had access to excellent schools, healthcare, housing, right? You were living the kind of life that many sort of, especially those that were escaping to the suburbs of the United States, kind of wanting to flee this idea of the cities that they no longer wanted, were in essence living. So you had that there, but you had it operating inside of another country. And the main way that that effectively is happening is through an interpretation of that 1903 treaty between Panama and the United States, whereby the United States says, well, we actually have control of this area economically, politically, socially, in every way, and your laws, your needs are not going to affect it. In addition to that, you have the implementation of explicit Jim Crow policies by the United States, whereby there is segregation based on race, in schooling, in housing, in employment. The police maintain a very strict line of who is allowed in what at one moment was called the silver roll housing, gold roll housing, silver roll housing, and silver facilities for non-white, non-U.S. citizens, gold for white U.S. citizens, and sort of select white Europeans. And this very much idea of maintaining a zone at the widest kind of possible zone in that you could imagine, but not in the actual US mainland, inside of another country. And so what this means is that you had that operating, but the bulk of those who worked in maintaining the canal and the services were Black Panamanians, right? So these were Black men and women who were born in the canal zone. Oftentimes their parents had been born in the Caribbean. And so you had at least 20,000, right, Black Panamanians in the canal zone by the 40s, who were in this limbo state of not being recognized as U.S. citizens, not being recognized as Panamanian citizens. And they're part of who I talk about in the book because they had this unique experience of seeing and experiencing U.S. empire from the sort of personal experience from pertaining to labor, to education, and also seeing that nationalism and that hyper-nationalism that impacted outside of the canal zone and the Republic of Panama was one that actually connected these Jim Crow followers in the canal zone and these hyper-nationalists in Panama. So they in turn had to think about, how do you navigate this world, right? How do you talk to your children about the reality that in these two spaces, both of whom they might imagine as their home, they're going to routinely be told, this is not where you belong, go back home, you have no rights here, we have nothing that we are obliged to give you. And so for that reason, I'm so fascinated by how teachers, labor union activists, newspaper publishers, etc., start to create a counter narrative to what is a continuous attempt at telling people who are living in these spaces that they have no right to be there, notwithstanding how many generations they've been there. And also to counter this narrative that they were kind of this powerless group of people just following under the whims of U.S. empire or whatever these sort of xenophobic politicians were saying. I want to present the realities of the difficulties of that, but also highlight that they were able to cement this idea of pride, of belonging from a long lineage that we can certainly connect to the UNIA and onwards, to the sense of you can still have a feeling of being of the world and for the world that can't be taken away from any national government or fascist leader.
So finally, in 1964, there was a mass uprising in Panama that ultimately led to Washington loosening its grip on the canal zone.
That's right.
Talk to us about that uprising, and was there Black participation in that mass uprising?
Yeah, so there was Black participation in that mass uprising. So in 64, and it followed a series of attempts at entering the canal zone and planting the flag, the Panamanian flag therein, or just entering it, period. As a Panamanian citizens, were not allowed to enter the canal zone without permission. And in fact, you couldn't even drive with a Panamanian car into the canal zone because you needed a license plate that was only issued by the canal zone to transit within that area. Responding to this sense of, well, how can it be that you have this landmass in our territory, but we cannot enter? And these planting of flags. Eventually, you actually have the U.S. fence off the canal zone. There hadn't been a physical fence before, but by the late 50s, you have it. The 60s, 64 movement by students in Panama City and Colón, as well as other supporters in the neighborhood surrounding the canal zone, respond to these decades-long process of repeatedly reminding Panamanians that this canal zone was not theirs. And so what you have is an actual decision by white U.S. citizens that are in the canal zone, students in this high school in Balboa, who decide we are actually in disagreement with the compromise that had been reached at the time to have the Panamanian flag fly alongside the U.S. flag in select spaces throughout the canal zone. They were opposed to that happening in front of their high school. And so as a result, you have this tussling that leads to the deaths of at least 22 Panamanian students and other people protesting. You have politicians going to the radio waves in Panama, calling people to defend themselves, some of them arm themselves. You also have U.S. citizens trying to flee, leave the canal zone in response to what they're seeing in terms of the military that's installed in the canal zone is telling them we can't necessarily protect you. And so there's all this happening in terms of a recognition that all of that socialist paradise that I mentioned before is no longer a reality by the 60s and onwards that is at play. And that main loss of life, the first time that a Latin American nation cuts ties with the United States, this happens, right? In 64, you have finally a real engaged international conversation about, is it not colonialism to have a spot like the canal zone existing? How are we all okay with this in our present sort of democracy-leaning Organization of American States, UN, etc.? You have an investment in the part of Panamanian officials, but also Panamanian migrants, most of them Black Panamanians that are in the United States campaigning on behalf of the end of U.S. control of the canal zone, the handing back of the canal. And so it's this interesting moment in which many of those whose parents were likely denied rights to citizenship by Arias administrations that came afterwards are the very ones who serve as the main spokespersons for why the canal zone should end and why the treaty had been so unfair. So it's kind of another one of those really eye-opening moments in which the very people who are often pushed aside are the ones that have the lived experience, the underground activism to highlight the injustice of something like the operation of a canal zone and a Panama Canal. It's those labor activists that collected all that information about unequal pay, who experienced Jim Crow in the canal zone, who are able to really effectively convince people on a larger scale of why a system like that is one that should not be allowed to exist anywhere in the world.
Finally, Professor Corinealdi, author of the book Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean World Making in the 20th Century, what's next on your research agenda?
Yeah, so there are two things that are right now on the top of my mind. One is I'm really interested in a political history of the province of Colón, which is the center of intense Pan-Africanist activism from really the beginning of the 20th century into the 60s. And I want to do a bit more in terms of unearthing who some of these key figures were. I talked a little bit about them in Panama in Black, but I think there's a way to really situate the city, the province in a rich way that connects with how there's actually this experience of leadership that aligns Colón with other parts of the Caribbean in really fascinating ways. And I'm also writing political histories of some of the first Black female activists, politicians in Panama throughout the 20th century. Started with people who were among the first to be elected once suffrage was extended to women, to a more recent timeline. So it's sort of political histories of Black life that are centered still in Panama, but with all of these people connecting it internationally, they're always so aware of the diaspora. Those are the main things that are right now igniting my attention.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor, author of the book Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean World Making in the 20th Century. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Professor Camilla Hawthorne. Thank you, Professor Kaysha Corinealdi. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon, our engineer, Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archive, scroll to Freedom Now. Signing off, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.